here, and this is the third video of my video series, My Sicilian Odyssey, the documentary of my first visit to Sicily, and a personal essay about Sicily and my Sicilian roots. My first was a slideshow of highlights from my trip, the second a historical and cultural overview of Sicily, and in this video I want to share some information about my Sicilian ancestors and their Sicilian-American immigrant descendants, my Sicilian-American Famiglia. Part 1, The Last Letter, The Immigrant's Name Dilemma. As mentioned in my first video, my name is Stephen Joseph Long. But that is not the name I was born with. My birth name differed only in one letter, a last letter, O. I am 100% of Sicilian descent, both paternal and maternal sides. I was born Stephen Joseph Longo on September 18, 1955 in Buffalo, New York. So, what happened to the last letter? My father wanted it dropped when he enrolled me in high school. Why? Well, the answer is consistent with the not uncommon practice of immigrants to America in the 19th and early 20th centuries, who either deliberately changed their names to facilitate quicker assimilation into Anglo-American culture and society, or had their names changed for them by immigration officers who had difficulty comprehending them. Typically, in this latter case, the immigrants were either illiterate, barely literate, or could not write their names in English. It was also typical that many of them ended up keeping their anglicized names, again to facilitate their assimilation into American society. Their motives for doing so revolved around the very real anti-immigrant, nativist, and xenophobic discrimination that greeted every succeeding new batch of immigrants to America. Discrimination that was based on two major beliefs. The first focused on the perceived otherness or foreignness that the new immigrants represented, based primarily on language, race, and creed. All non-English speakers were pegged as untrustworthy, inscrutable, and incompatible with Anglo-American culture and society. And if they were not Protestant Christian, but, say, Roman Catholic, this magnified the distrust. For papists, as Catholics were called, could not be trusted as Americans because of divided loyalties. Would they be more beholden to the Pope or to American democratic institutions? Plus, Protestants already harbored animus toward Catholics, who they viewed as idolaters and pagans who practiced archaic and barbarous rituals. And there was, of course, anti-Semitism against Jews. The second major belief was that since most of the new immigrants were unskilled and poor, they would be more likely to be hired in industrial America to fill lower-paid jobs and therefore would steal jobs away from native-born Americans. Those were the main motives behind changing your native surname, but the desire to distance oneself from the old country and the past and embrace a new life, a newer future, was also quite common. For America represented reinvention, progress, and change, which was something many immigrants were attracted to, a chance to break free from the shackles of the old world. And if immigrants themselves didn't change their names, they often decided to do so for their offspring, the second generation, in the belief that this would remove the stigma attached to their old non-American names and remove the obstacles of discrimination and distrust imposed by Anglo-American culture and society. For it was their fervent hope that their children would rise higher than they ever did socioeconomically. As case in point, I have no doubt whatsoever that these beliefs animated my father's desire to drop just that one letter from my name when I entered high school. For although he himself rose higher socioeconomically than his father and grandfather by being the first of his line to complete 13 years of education, since his father had only gone to a few years of schooling in Sicily, and I do not know if my great-grandfather attended school at all. And he was also the first to move into a white-collar occupation as an insurance and real estate agent. I am sure he envisioned for his only son something even higher, a college education and profession. It's the old cliche of the parent proudly introducing, "My son, the doctor." Though I never became a doctor, I did become the second of my generation to graduate from a 4-year university, which I converted into a 31-year teaching career. In fact, out of the 21 members of my generation, myself, my siblings, and all my cousins, only 4 of us graduated from a 4-year university and went beyond that. This reminds me of one of the last scenes in Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather, when the aging patriarch, Don Vito Corleone, is speaking to his youngest son, Michael, in his garden, explaining how he never wanted the life of a Mafia Don for his son, one in which, although he, as a puppet master, pulled the strings of many below him, he was still a puppet to those higher than he who pulled strings on him. Instead, he wanted his son to, quote, be the one pulling the strings, Senator Corleone, a step higher for his son than where his father had gotten to. In this context, my father's dropping the O was his way of paving an easier path for me to be like Michael Corleone and surpass the step that he had reached. It should be noted, however, that there is an irony and contradiction about my name change. For it was not done at my birth, or even during my early childhood. It was done in 1969 when I was 13. And I must add, not legally either, not until I turned 21. Why did he wait? And by the time he took this action, were Italian surnames in America still a stigma that elicited discrimination? Still an impediment to socioeconomic upward mobility? I think not. For well before 1969, and despite the notoriety of infamous Italian names associated with the American Mafia like Capone, Luciano, Giancana, and Genovese, there had also been Italian names associated with legitimate success stories. Sinatra, Boiardi, Gioia, LaGuardia, Marciano, DiMaggio, and even in our home city of Buffalo, its first Italian-American mayor, Frank Sedita, and in New York State politics, Mario Cuomo. Not to mention my pediatrician, Dr. Thomas Lombardo, and the extended family's doctor, Dr. Anthony Colangelo, and the lawyer my father used for our auto accident case, Anthony J. DiMarie. So, there didn't seem to be any grounds by that late date to keep thinking that Italian surnames were obstacles, even though some Italian Americans had changed theirs, like Tony Bennett, Connie Francis, Dean Martin, and Bobby Darin, for example. I can only suppose that my father felt he might as well give it a shot and a last-ditch effort to remove the hurdle, even though he himself displayed the contradiction of continued association and affinity with other Italian Americans when it came to doctors, lawyers, restaurateurs, and car mechanics, for he only ever felt comfortable using Italian Americans. How did the rest of the family feel about dropping the O? Interestingly, his own father and siblings seemed to understand and not object. In fact, I just discovered very recently, while combing through a stash of old photos, one of my grandfather, Frank Alfred Longo, born Francesco Alfredo in Cerda, Sicily, as an employee of the Curtiss-Wright Aircraft Corporation, wearing a name tag that said, I quote, Frank A. Long. Apparently, even he felt the desire to drop the O, at least a decade or more before my father did for me. But neither of his two other sons, Salvatore and Joseph, did for themselves or their sons. As for my uncles on my mother's side, her brothers-in-law, two of the three scoffed at the idea of changing their Italian names, wearing them proudly, thumbing their noses at those who chose to associate them with the Mafia or otherwise cast aspersions. The third brother-in-law, however, went much farther than my father, and earlier. Not long after his first son was born, who was the second eldest of my mother and her siblings' children after me, I being the oldest, he changed their surname from Saccone to Sicilian. And not long after that, he went so far as to change his religion to Judaism. If the other two uncles disapproved of my father's action, they regarded my third maternal uncle's actions as blasphemous, shameful, and reprehensible. I must add at this point that my maternal grandfather changed his name shortly after he married my grandmother. Curiously, he didn't change it to an anglicized name, but just to another Italian name. He went from Angelo to Angelo. The reason? To dissociate himself from his Angelo family, which apparently carried too much toxic baggage, not the least of which was the fact that his brother was involved in local organized crime. At this point, I feel compelled to interject some facts that I have never known before until doing research for this narration. Lest any of you doubt the toxicity of the racism and discrimination directed toward Italian Americans in general and toward Sicilian Americans specifically, let me share with you what I am certain is a little-known fact. The single largest lynching incident in American history was perpetrated not against African Americans, but against Italian Americans. In 1891, a mob of white Louisianians in Metairie, a suburb of New Orleans, lynched 11 Italian Americans, Sicilians to be exact, in front of a large crowd. They had already been tried and acquitted by a jury for the alleged murder of then Police Chief David Hennessy, who was gunned down during his investigation into a murder committed during a feud between rival Sicilian businessmen. The 11 who were rounded up were acquitted because of lack of evidence, despite bribes being paid by locals to some of the jurors to get a conviction. They were being held temporarily in the city jailhouse when newspapers stirred up the most vile batch of xenophobic, nativistic, and racist vilifications of Italians imaginable, calling them everything from demons to rattlesnakes. The New Orleans mob stormed the jailhouse and forcibly brought them out to be hanged the next day. The outcry from the Italian American community was loud, and it reverberated throughout the nation. Appeals were made to local Louisiana politicians for justice, but they went ignored. They even went as far as the White House, entreating the intervention of President Benjamin Harrison. Even he said it must be handled as a local matter. The Italian consulate was contacted, and the government of Italy recalled its ambassador to the U.S., demanding action from Washington, D.C., lest they stir up international discord. The threat worked. Harrison, mindful of the sullied reputation of the United States due to the previous two wars it fought, the Mexican War and the Civil War, wished to improve America's standing and regard on the international stage. In response, he did two things. First, he ordered that each of the victims' families receive $25,000, which in today's dollars would be equivalent to nearly $750,000. And second, he ordered, by presidential proclamation, the first official celebration commemorating Columbus Day in the United States in 1892, exactly 400 years since Columbus' discovery. Although it did not become an official annual national holiday until FDR got Congress to approve it in 1937, the origin and establishment of Columbus Day came in direct response to the most violent lynching incident in American history, one directed with a vicious vehemence at Italian Americans. I include this just in case anyone thinks that systemic racism against them in America is an exaggeration. And I would also hasten to caution any of my fellow Italian Americans or fellow Sicilian Americans who harbor anti-immigrant nativist feelings toward immigrants. You should be ashamed of yourself. Knowing this, to harbor feelings that you are anti-immigrants, you need to consider the history of Italian immigrants to America. My forebears. My genealogy adventure. Everything I now know about my genealogy comes from the following sources. 1. Bits and pieces from anecdotal recollections from my one grandparent, my maternal grandmother, who lived until age 88 and died in 1997. And 2. My parents and aunts and uncles, and 1 or 2 elder cousins. And 3. Actual genealogical research conducted by a professional genealogist at Trace.com, a Utah-based company. Utah is the Mormon state, and the Mormons are famous for amassing encyclopedic repositories of genealogical information because of their peculiar religious belief that they can add new Mormon converts to their rolls of the Latter-day Saints. And also research conducted by Miss Jennifer Petrino, a Sicilian-American in Atlanta who does genealogical researches for Sicilian Americans. I recently and finally was able to create an extensive family tree on Ancestry.com. It was not easy. In fact, it was extremely difficult, because by the time I started having an interest in knowing about my ancestors, all of my great-grandparents and 3 of my grandparents had already died. I then had to tap my parents and their siblings, and what I encountered when I pursued inquiries was A, an abysmal lack of documentary information in the form of vital records or photos, B, spotty at best anecdotal recollections, and C, in some cases, like my father's, a deliberate reluctance and disinterest in reporting any oral history about our forebears. And his reticence regarding this is revealingly consistent with his desire to want my name changed. Whenever I pursued this line of inquiry, his response was invariably, "Who cares? Nobody wants to know any of that old stuff." His attitude was ironic and annoyingly contradictory, for he liked watching history movies, and in fact, it was his taking me to those movies in the theaters on the big screen when I was a young boy, starting at about age 7, that left such an impression on me that I would later translate that into an interest that resulted in a career in history. Of my relatives, the only one who gave me the most information was my father's sister, the oldest child of my Longo grandparents, my Aunt Margie. I remember the day. I was at the grandparents' house, and I asked my father some questions. Consistent with his disinterested attitude, he told me, "Go upstairs and ask your Aunt Margie." He called up to her, "Marge, Stephen wants to ask you some questions." To my surprise, she did sit down with me and told me several interesting bits of information, so surprising and fascinating that they provided the kernels of curiosity that I would incessantly seek to investigate. I also, and later, was the recipient of equally fascinating information from my maternal grandmother, Frances Angelo nei Baroni. With what I learned from the trace genealogist's work and the work of Jennifer Petrino, this is what I know about my Sicilian forebears. The farthest back in time that I have any specific information about my ancestors is roughly 1820s, which are the years of the births of my two paternal great-great-grandparents, Pietro Giraffa and Maria Papagna, the grandparents of my paternal grandmother, Josephine Giraffa, in the town of Termini and Maresi. I also have the names of my great-great-grandparents on my grandfather's side, who were his mother's parents, Francesco La Chiusa and Filippa Messina. But I do not have their birth years, only the death year of Francesco, which was 1883. All indications are that they were from the town of Cerda. The first Longos. The earliest Longo was Salvatore Longo, my paternal great-grandfather, who was born in Termini and Maresi on August 8th, 1846. My Aunt Margie told me that she remembers, quote, they all used to talk about La Cerda, and that they used to talk about, quote, going to Termini. She also told me that the surname was originally Luongo, but that they, quote, changed it when they came to America, when they dropped the U. She also said that, quote, he was a cavaliere, a horseman, a mounted policeman, and that he had to leave because he was a witness to a murder. The trace genealogist research could only support his name as Longo, no evidence of Luongo. That he was born in Termini in 1846 and later moved to Cerda, where he married the widow Margherita La Chiusa, born in Cerda, August 25, 1853, who already had a daughter with her first husband, Cruciano Ortolano, who was named Giuseppa Lucia Ortolano, born on May 18, 1877, in Cerda. That marriage took place in Cerda on October 30th, 1883. The genealogists did not find any evidence to support that he was a cavaliere, only that he was listed as a, quote, industrioso, or laborer, or that he emigrated because he was a witness to a murder. However, certain aspects about my great-grandfather's life, which I found out later, make my Aunt Marge's information plausible. First, I found out from Mrs. Petrino that my great-grandfather was actually not even a Longo. And this was something my Aunt Marge never told me. I don't know if she knew, but she never mentioned it. She always referred to him as Salvatore, but in fact his name was Gaetano, which is essentially the equivalent of the very generic English name Guy. And that was probably because of another even bigger surprise. He was an orphaned foundling, deposited, literally, in the, quote, receiving wheel, end quote, of the local church in Termini. Apparently, every local church had a receiving wheel, a wooden circular wheel with spaces for people to deposit offerings and also babies, newborns, unwanted for whatever reason. A local woman would sneak up under the cover of darkness, doubtless head covered, and drop off the unwanted infant in a compartment, turn the wheel so the compartment would be rotated into the church courtyard, and pull the rope to ring the bell so a nun, priest, or servant would come and pick it up. Miss Petrino was able to find out that the woman in the church who retrieved the baby was Maria Anna Giovenco, who entered the baby's name as Gaetano Longo, and his birth was recorded as having taken place on August 8, 1846. The surname was given to him most likely because she found a woman to wet nurse him, whose name was Margherita Longo, who was married to a Giovanni. No last name was listed for him, so we don't know if Margherita's maiden or married name was Longo. This was a stunning bit of information that I just learned of only about a month ago. No one in my extended family ever mentioned anything like this. It seems likely that the baby was raised by Margherita and Giovanni as a Longo. Thus, we are not genetically descended from any Longos, at least not his apparent adopted parents, even though that is the surname of my grandfather, his brother, and my father and his siblings and cousins. We have no idea who the real natural parents were of our great-grandfather, who his real mother was, who deposited him in the receiving wheel and why she did, or who his blood father was. On Gaetano and Margherita's marriage certificate, it listed her parents, her birthplace, and their town of residence. Gaetano's birth date and town, Termini, but in the space for his parents, it said unknown. Regarding my Aunt Marge's other assertion, that he was a cavaliere who witnessed a murder and because of that had to emigrate to America, several facts about his life, some provided by Mrs. Petrino and others provided from the history of Sicily itself, make her assertion plausible. Although the marriage certificate lists Gaetano as being a, quote, industrioso, we know from other documents that Mrs. Petrino discovered, namely a military discharge, that Gaetano had served in the Italian military and was honorably discharged. This makes it more likely that he could have indeed been a cavaliere, a horseman, and a local policeman, since being in the military unit would afford locals the opportunity to train as local cavalry, and in Sicily, horses, though plentiful, were reserved mostly for those lucky enough to have been given roles as professional riders. Peasants were relegated to donkeys. And if, after being discharged, he had the role of a local civilian constable, based on his military experience, that would have put him in the position of having to deal with local security situations. And finally, considering the nature of Sicilian society and economic conditions in the 19th century, which had not changed since medieval times, local economics and politics was rife with feuds between barons and their retinues, as well as bandits, and it was highly likely that he would have been witness to a murder that was a vendetta. In that circumstance, his own life and the lives of his sons would have been in jeopardy. Therefore, it becomes perfectly plausible that he would have had to flee Sicily, and by himself. When Gaetano married the widow Margherita Lacchiusa on October 30th, 1883, he not only had a wife to take care of, but her 6-year-old daughter from her late husband, and within a year of that marriage, he had another child, his own with Margherita, named Giuseppe C. Longo, born November 9, 1884. 3 years later, his second son, Francesco Alfredo, was born. What is fascinating and curious is that just 3 years after that, Gaetano left them all. A widowed wife of 37 with 3 children, aged 13, 6, and 3, and emigrated to America, never returning. This seems stunningly surprising, sudden, and unusual for a man of 44 to leave his wife and 3 young children to fend ostensibly for themselves in rural Sicily. What if misfortune would befall him on the passage? What if misfortune would befall him after his arrival in America? Any number of hardships and setbacks was likely for an immigrant with meager means trying to establish himself in the new world with enough money to send back to his family in impoverished Sicily to sustain them for 15 years, which was when his wife, second son, and stepdaughter finally emigrated to be reunited with him. For it wasn't until 1905 when they left Cerda for America. Furthermore, it was only once he arrived in America that he started using the name Salvatore as his name. And it was my Aunt Marge who told me that his surname was originally Longo, and that he changed it when he came to America by dropping the U. I also found it odd that his eldest son Giuseppe also left his mother, stepsister, and younger brother, who was 13, in 1900, at age 16, to emigrate to the United States and never return. And that when he did not connect with his father, who settled in Buffalo, but instead settled in a boarding house with a small group of other men from Cerda in the rural town of Warsaw in Wyoming County, where they worked at a rail yard. Why wouldn't his father have wanted him to live with him? And it wasn't until 5 more years later that he would call for his wife, stepdaughter, and youngest son to emigrate and finally reunite with him in Buffalo. That means that my great-grandfather left them and never returned for 15 years before finally getting them settled in their new life together in America. 15 years was a long time at the turn of the 20th century, especially for poor rural Sicilian immigrants. A lot could easily have happened. Therefore, one can arguably conclude that something pretty important must have forced my great-grandfather to so suddenly abandon his family in rural Sicily by moving across the world to a small city 500 miles from New York along the Niagara River, never returning, and start using a different name, and even when his 16-year-old son came to America, not reunite with him, but instead have him live with others unrelated to him in an even more remote location. And when you consider that it would be 15 years in total before he was able to be reunited with all of his family under one roof, I think this supports an argument that he seemed to need to put not only great distance, but a lot of time between Cerda and himself. I would say, therefore, that these facts tend to support my Aunt Marge's tale, though we do not have direct documentary evidence. Besides, even though eyewitnesses and anecdotal oral history can be inaccurate, I just do not believe that she would fabricate what she told me. And the factual information I subsequently uncovered, I believe, supports it. When Gaetano Salvatore finally, who also sometimes used the name Sam, brought his entire family under one roof in 1905 in a house on 7th Street on the west side of Buffalo, the part of the city where most of the Sicilian immigrants lived, it being one of the low-rent and lower-class sections of the city along the Niagara River waterfront. His eldest son, Giuseppe, was 21, working in a furniture store, and married to Cosimo Sobaldo. My granduncle, Giuseppe, who I never knew, anglicized his name to Joseph, and a few years later moved to Niagara Falls, New York, where he was able to own his own furniture store. He had 4 children with Cosima. She actually had 5, but one did not live past 6. But I knew only one of them, Josephine, obviously named for her father, who for some inexplicable reason, and I still do not know the answer, we always and only called Aunt Peggy. When she married Signorino Nibali, who changed his name to Sager Nibro, she moved back to Buffalo, where she remained until her death at age 95. Her 4 daughters with Sager I do remember, since one of them was close to my age. It's a shame I never knew my granduncle, and I did not even know I had one for most of my life until 2005, when I somehow managed to persuade my father to take me to visit my 94-year-old Aunt Peggy to ask her questions about the family, none of us in my generation, myself, siblings, and cousins, knew that our grandfather had a brother. When, in 1905, my great-grandfather was finally reunited with his family, his second son, Francesco Alfredo, was 18 and playing a strange-looking guitar, a large-bodied, double-fretted acoustic thing that had what looked like a set of harp strings in addition to the guitar fret, with a partner who played mandolin. I have several photos of this, which must have been taken in Buffalo, so I can only assume that my grandfather was earning some money performing locally, though I do not know this for sure. He, too, anglicized his name to Frank Alfred Longo. 3 years after he immigrated to America at age 21, he too married a girl who was his neighbor on 7th Street, 2 years younger than he, named Josephine Giraffa. My grandmother Longo was born in Buffalo, since her parents, Domenico Giraffa, born in 1845 in Termini Imerese, and Louise Comapara, born in 1860, had already emigrated to the U.S. prior to her birth. The photos I have of her as a young woman are stunning. She was the epitome of the Gibson girl, with her hair pulled up in that fashion, wearing the white chiffon high ruffled collar, blouse, and wearing a cameo-pinned choker. She was born in 1889, married my grandfather at age 19, and remained married to him until her death at the age of 78 in 1967. She had 4 children with him, although I was told that she delivered a 5th that was stillborn, and it is highly probable that she may have been pregnant at least 6 times. The second Longos. The 4 children of Frank Alfred Longo and Josephine Giraffa were, in order, Margaret, likely named for her paternal grandmother Margherita Lacchiusa; Salvatore, likely named for his paternal grandfather Gaetano, Salvatore Sam Longo; Frank Alfred Jr., the anglicized name directly for his father, my grandfather Francesco Alfredo; and Joseph Philip, likely named for his uncle Giuseppe, and paternal great-grandmother Filippa Messina. Frank Alfred Jr. was my father. He always hated being called Junior. Approximately around the time my grandfather married, I believe he started working as a barber. In 1911, his first child was born, my Aunt Margie. 2 years later, his second child, and first son was born, my Uncle Sal. I would imagine around this time he moved out of his father's house on 7th Street and to Hudson Street, still on the west side, where he rented a flat behind the barber shop where he worked. Eventually, he was able to purchase the barber shop, and later the building next to it, which was a 2.5-story brick house where he raised his family. Our paternal great-grandfather, Gaetano Salvatore Sam, apparently stayed on 7th Street, where he died in 1926 at the age of 80. His wife, my great-grandmother Margherita, lived 4 more years after his passing, dying in 1930 at the age of 77. Once I started developing an interest in my forebears, I wondered why neither my father nor any of his siblings ever spoke of their grandparents. I once asked him, "Did you know your grandparents?" He struggled with an answer, unsure. I thought that odd. When I finally got this chronological data, it became obvious. My father was born in 1927, a year after his grandfather died, and he was only 3 when his grandmother passed away. Only my Aunt Margaret, the oldest of my father's siblings, could possibly have remembered them. She would have been 15 when her grandfather died and 19 when her grandmother died. But I never heard her speak of them either. Probably, and only because when I finally queried her about my forebears, I didn't think to ask that question. and she never independently brought it up. My Uncle Sal would have also remembered his grandparents since he was 13 when his grandfather died and 17 when his grandmother did. But I rarely ever saw him. He'd moved to New Jersey around 1950, and the few times I did, I was not yet interested in the genealogical research that I was later to be interested in. It is a shame that I didn't have such an interest when I was younger, though I'm not sure my dad would have been much help even then. But there might have been a lot more I could have uncovered from my Aunt Marge earlier on, giving me a much bigger head start. She died in 1999 at the age of 88, and I had only tapped her knowledge in the late 1980s at the earliest. Dealing with the devil. The topic of the Mafia must, unfortunately, be broached. There was a Mafia, specifically the Black Hand in western New York, centered primarily in Niagara Falls, because of its ideal proximity and equidistance between Buffalo, Rochester, Hamilton, and Toronto, Canada. Plus, during Prohibition, from 1919 to 1933, these locations on Lakes Erie and Ontario and on the Niagara River were golden opportunities to run liquor from Canada, where it was not prohibited. And my grandfather's barbershop was a perfect, legitimate business to disguise an illegal bootlegging operation. And he and some of his friends, kumbaris, the Sicilian-American's pronunciation of compadres, went in on a beautiful 4.6-acre lakefront property, 4325 Lakeshore Road in Hamburg, New York, built in 1888 and designed by architect Edward Austin Kent in what Redfin Incorporated described as, quote, a truly American architectural style and historic shingle, 4 fireplaces, a rear carriage house, a gardener's cottage, an ice house, and a water pump tower with spectacular views of sunsets and the Canadian shoreline that was last sold in 2018 for $550,000. It was also an ideal location, literally on the Lake Erie shore, where illegal booze could be easily loaded from Canada, hidden, and then trucked to Hudson Street's barbershop basement, where, amazingly, they connected via a tunnel under the street to the basement of an abandoned church across the street. I don't know the exact dates for when they had this operation, but at some point before Prohibition ended, they got busted. 3 suspects were arrested, including my grandfather. Sometime in the late 1960s, I recall him visiting our house, and in the backyard was able to eavesdrop on a conversation he was having with my mother's brother-in-law, my Uncle Joe Faruto. At some point, my grandfather took out his wallet and pulled out a withered piece of newspaper, which he opened up to show my uncle. I was able to see a headline and a photo on it. It read, "Longo pleads guilty," and it had a small photo of my grandfather. I overheard him telling my uncle, "Yeah, I told him I'd take the rap. I'd do the time, 'cause I was the youngest. It was nothing. They give me 3 months in a jail. There's nothing, no problem. I cut the police a hair. And my wife, she come to do the jail. I give her some money, for grocery." Clearly, to my grandfather, this was a badge of honor to have been arrested and jailed, a romanticization, to say the least, but also an indication that those convicted of violating the Volstead Act got very light sentences. However, his family did not romanticize this cavalier attitude, for they had to pay the price of his transgression. All property seized in the prosecution was subject to confiscation by the courts, and in this case, the family lost the gorgeous lakeshore property. He was lucky to have retained his barber shop and the house next door. I heard my father say repeatedly that he remembered that the lakeshore property, and he was heartbroken that they no longer had it. My father, who was born in 1927, so he would have only been 3 to 6 years old before the 18th Amendment was repealed, but he swears he remembered it. And it's all the more a shame because for Sicilians who came to Buffalo at the turn of the century, to own a property like that was a dream come true. How many Sicilians who emigrated to America to flee the poverty and landlessness that was the only lot that they and their ancestors ever knew would have given their right arm to have owned a property like that? Suffice it to say, my family never recaptured the socioeconomic step up they had when they owned that property. Such was the wages of reckless flirtation with the black market and criminal enterprises. One might expect that my grandfather would have learned from this, but he didn't. For he would embark on yet another, far more sinister foray into nefarious black market dealings. His eldest daughter, Margaret, was the first to marry in 1934 at age 23 to John A. Sodaro. Undoubtedly, a child was immediately expected. However, they apparently had difficulty conceiving, or her getting pregnant and carrying it to term. I do not know which. But a miracle occurred. A little angel, as if from heaven, appeared. An infant girl, which they ended up naming, appropriately, Angela. But where'd she come from? Apparently, my grandfather asked his associates, who might be able to provide this sort of thing, how? In point of fact, it seems that there has always been a booming black market in infant theft in America. And it was quite prevalent in the early decades of the 20th century when doctors and hospitals peddled a push for women to have their babies in hospitals. Problem was, maternity wards were astoundingly insecure, and it was easy to lose track of newborns, many of whom were just plain stolen and sold on the black market. And hospitals, doctors and nurses were often in on the theft, pocketing extra cash from the transactions. So, was little Angela an illegitimate child of a fellow married Sicilian-American man and his mistress? If so, we can't help wonder how the infant was pried from its mother. Or was the infant simply stolen from a local hospital's maternity ward? Did my grandfather's accomplice just pay a nurse at the hospital to look the other way so they could steal one? Imagine the plight of the mother at the hospital. Did they just tell her her newborn died? In fact, that is exactly what they told many mothers in maternity wards, who conveniently were the recipients of another new practice, sedatives, during and immediately after labor. However they obtained this miracle baby, the arrival of little Angela was a gift that instead of coming from heaven, came from somewhere far less angelic. Thus, the oldest of my generation in the Longos extended family was my cousin Angela, who I remember vividly. In fact, my parents employed her on more than one occasion to babysit me when I was between the ages of 4 and 7, and my recollections of her are all positive. I remember her to have been a pleasant, polite, affable person, and I had nothing but fond memories of her. In fact, the entire family doted on her. All her uncles loved her. But unbeknownst to me, at least, was this dark secret surrounding her birth and arrival in the family. A secret that was concealed and kept from her by everyone who knew about it. I must assume that her mother and her siblings knew about it, though they may not have known the precise details and may not have wanted to. This shrouded family secret could and would become an explosive mine buried along the trails of Angelo's life that could detonate her and her family's path. When my Aunt Marge and Uncle John Sidaro somehow managed to produce a true miracle, she got pregnant and delivered a child on her own, a boy named for his father, John A. Sidaro, Jr. Everyone who knew about the darker miracle felt confident that they could put it out of their minds forever. However, family secrets have a tendency to escape their dungeons, even by accident. And this one got out at, of all places and times, Angelo's wedding. During a toast, my grandfather leaned over to someone, my Aunt Marge perhaps, and said, apparently a little too loudly, "Does she know?" A bride at her wedding, hearing her grandfather ask surreptitiously, "Does she know?" can't possibly ignore that. I'm not sure where and when exactly, but eventually she got her mother to tell her. And Angela was, quite understandably, shocked. She felt betrayed. Why did the family that raised her have to keep that from her for so long? Or at all? I can't imagine what that must have felt like, but I can certainly sympathize. She didn't take it well at all. She pressed her mother for details. Who was her real mother? I don't know what my aunt told her, but I know she didn't give Angelo that information, either because she didn't really ever know it, or just refused to divulge it. But one thing is certain. My cousin John, her brother, I guess stepbrother, but we never thought of Angela as a step cousin, was going through his mother's possessions after she died and found all sorts of documents. But what he never found was a birth certificate for Angela. The epilogue of this was that eventually my cousin Angela's resentment toward her mother specifically, and the family in general, grew to the point that after she got a divorce from her husband, who I do remember as quite a jerk, she met someone else, and she and he, along with her son from her marriage, moved to Florida, where she has been ever since. I don't think she ever came back even to visit. And when her mother died in 1999, she didn't even attend the funeral. Such are the wages of sin. Was it wrong to adopt a baby? No. But was hers a legitimate adoption? No. And then the decades-long concealment, exploded by my grandfather's foolish remark at her wedding, obviously that had a price to pay. Since my goal here was to describe my great-grandparents and grandparents' generation, and in so doing I had to include my grandfather and his exploits, which were colorful, to put it mildly, and since his forays operating outside the legitimate avenues of commerce and in normal family matters got him into more trouble than what I'm sure he'd wanted, I thought it apropos to include them. On my maternal side, there was my grandfather, Joseph Ogello. It is extremely regrettable that I have so little information about him, except that, as mentioned earlier, he was born, my maternal grandmother said, in Erie, Pennsylvania, and had at least one brother, James. But, she also said, his family was so dysfunctional and unpleasant that he changed his surname to Angelo One, because he wanted to simply distance himself from them. And two, because his brother Jimmy, an undertaker, definitely had associations with the Mafia. I remember him as a generally quiet man, reserved, kindly, and fatherly. So much so that for as long as I can remember, there were always dogs at his house. He had a soft spot for animals, and my grandmother told me that ever since she could remember, he would befriend a stray dog that would follow him home from work, and he would bring it home and raise it. And raise it well, he did. His dogs were so well behaved that he trained them to urinate and defecate at the very farthest place in the backyard, literally to the back wooden stockade fence where he had a wooden pallet where he put his trash cans. They were so obedient that despite having no barrier or crate, they would not ever dare to venture past the kitchen into the dining room or parlor. My grandfather also had an amazing green thumb. My grandfather Longo did also, but in his case it was for flowers, tulips mostly. The Hudson Street house was perennially bounded by rows of brightly colored tulips. But my grandfather Angelo's green thumb was with fruits and vegetables. His garden in the backyard produced literally an open-air market-sized cornucopia of greens, onions, tomatoes, berries, and even a trellis for white grapes. No olives, though. That garden was productive ever since I can remember and up until at least the 1990s. My grandpa Angelo worked several different blue-collar jobs, all legitimate and never went anywhere near anything illegal. He'd purchased the house on Lakeview Avenue on the west side of Buffalo near the Niagara River waterfront from his wife's family, and he lived there until he passed away in 1967. My grandmother continued living there until she died in 1997. The two of them raised 4 daughters in a house that had only 2.5 bedrooms and one, just one, excruciatingly small and narrow bathroom. Imagine a family of 6, 2 parents and 4 daughters, growing up in that today. For a time, my grandfather Joe worked for Pierce Arrow, the automobile manufacturer who had its only factory in Buffalo. Pierce Arrow was founded in 1901 and lasted until 1934, producing one of the finest automobiles in U.S. history. A luxury sedan in its day, it was the favored car of many celebrities and was the first car purchased and used as an official car for a U.S. president, William Howard Taft. He liked it for many reasons, not the least of which was for its size, something the largest president in American history would certainly need. It is a shame that I know so little about my grandfather Angelo. After all, my mother gave me his name for my middle name, Joseph. And she, his firstborn, was named Josephine for him. I remember he had a car. It was a 1950s DeSoto. Can't recall what year exactly. He was the only one of my grandparents who ever drove a car. The car was a two-toned green, dark green top, light green bottom, big, solid steel car it was, with the old, hard plastic steering wheels and long before there were seatbelts. I remember riding in it with him. After he died, my grandmother wanted to sell it. I remember hearing that my Uncle Joe Ferruto, who married the youngest Angelo daughter, Patricia, pleaded with my grandmother not to sell it, to hold on to it until he could find a good buyer for it. But my grandmother knew she'd never need it, and well, it reminded her of her late husband, so she sold it. Get this, for $50. That's $50, 50, a 1950s DeSoto. My uncle was practically apoplectic. Speaking of my maternal grandmother, Frances Barone was, to all of her grandchildren, the epitome of a grandmother. Unlike my paternal grandmother, Josephine Giarafa, who for the entire time I encountered her, I never saw a smile, but instead always had what we Sicilian-Americans used to call a funge, a sour expression on her face. My grandmother, Angelo, was the complete opposite. When we asked my father why his mother never smiled but always was miserable looking, his answer was always, "That was because of my father." I guess I can believe that. To be sure, my Grandma Frances upheld the common behavioral trait that seems to be shared by almost everyone of Mediterranean ancestry, that of the constant kvetcher. Every day was a struggle about this, that, or the other thing. But she nevertheless was always cheerful to us grandkids. Without fail, whenever we visited her, she'd make sure she had pocket change to give us to run to the corner store to get whatever we wanted, which was usually candy of some sort or bubblegum cards. Whenever she babysat us, she never shied away from sitting with us on the sofa to tell stories, watch TV with us, or even sing to us. We never got anything near approaching this with my Grandma Longo. She was born Frances. I don't know if she had a middle name, but my guess it might have been Caroline. She was the eldest of two children, to Orazio Barone and Caroline Martina, or she said it was La Martina. She was born in 1908 in Buffalo. I assume her parents were born in Sicily. Alas, she never told me where, so I have literally nothing to base any genealogical research on her side, which is very disappointing. Her father owned a furniture store. Seems to have been a popular occupation among the Sicilians in Buffalo. And I have a couple of photos, one extremely old, of what seems to be of him and his wife, circa turn of the century or earlier, though I'm not sure when or where. Was it around the time of their wedding? That photo is in poor condition. I have another photo in much better condition of a man who, I was told, was her father, Orazio. Remarkably, he looks a little bit like my grandfather Joe Angelo, but he also has facial features of my grandmother. My grandmother Angelo had an extremely rough early life. Both her parents died when she and her younger brother Charlie were young. She was probably in her teens. Being still a minor, some relatives, I'm not sure exactly who, to avert the stigma of consigning the siblings to an orphanage, took over fostering them. But they were so resentful about having to do so that they never neglected a moment reminding them of just how magnanimous they were. Consequently, they were extremely harsh and strict with them. My grandmother, who as a child loved to dance and do acrobatics, was constantly harangued to stop what they regarded as unladylike and frivolous behavior, and they expected her to essentially pay back the magnanimity of her foster parents by being nothing more than a household drudge, cleaning, cooking, washing clothes, fetching food, and taking care of her younger brother. She had already attended elementary school up to 5th grade, something her deceased parents wanted for her. She loved school and wanted to continue, but her evil step-parents pulled her out of school and refused to allow her to continue. They went so far as to hide her and lie about her whereabouts to the school's truant officer, who came knocking on their door periodically to inquire about young Frances. My grandmother said she had to fight back tears. Not so for her brother Charlie, of course, for girls were to be kept like sacred objects, pruned, primed, and dutifully pure for one purpose only, to be married off, preferably to a husband with promising financial prospects. Charlie behaved like any other boy, so much so that he and a few of his friends, among whom was an owner of a shotgun, decided to do a little target shooting with it. As I understand it, they bickered over the range of the pellet shot before it fell to the ground. As crazy as it sounds, one kid would go far off into the distance and hold out his arm while the others fired the shotgun, and at far enough range, none of the shot would reach his arm. After all, at such a long range, what harm would a few pellets do? Then they'd move up a little closer, or at least that's what Charlie did, except he moved too close, and he took a boatload of pellets into his arm. Oops. As seemingly harmless as this might sound, having dozens of pellets penetrating your arm, some in the bone, would be very difficult to fix medically. Excision of those pellets would be physically problematic, to say the least, especially for any that did embed into a bone. Plus, if not the process of excision and removal, then just the fact that you had all those pellets in your tissues ran up the likelihood of sepsis, which in Charlie's case was exactly what happened. And I suspect that penicillin was not yet available. Infection, sepsis, fever, all set in, and the doctor's prognosis was a simple choice: amputation or a slow and painful death. To say my grandmother was in deep distress would be an understatement. To compound her distress further, her step-parents decided against amputation. They said they couldn't brook the idea of having an amputee for a stepson. After all, how could they possibly get him married to anyone, having lost an arm? How could he work and have gainful income? They certainly didn't want to have to keep taking care of him, having sacrificed so much taking him in when they did as a youngster. So they decided they'd take their chances with the Lord and pray for recovery. But the Lord did not comply. My grandmother Frances' beloved younger brother Charles Baroni died at the age of 16. Plunged into grief, she never forgave her step-parents for his death. She would have been more than happy to have taken care of her brother, even as an amputee. Alone and intensely embittered, when she met Joe Angelo, who took a liking to her, it was a godsend. Of course, her step-parents tried to step in and oversee their stepdaughter's dalliance with her chosen beau, but she was probably 21 by then, so she thumbed her nose at their protestations. They got married and managed to wrest a property that had been owned by her parents, a small house on Lakeview Avenue, which her step-parents had custody of. My grandfather, Joe, put up their asking price and pried it from their greedy grip, and that enabled both he and Frances to start a new life apart from dysfunctional relatives. Regarding my parents' generation, on my father's side, my Aunt Marge, who was the eldest, who had the Mafia's baby, the eldest of my generation, Angela, had one son naturally with her husband, John A. Sodaro, but when John A. Sodaro Jr. was just 2 years old, his father suddenly died. A heart attack. This was a devastating blow. My Aunt Marge, I'm sure, was disconsolate. I'd imagine Angela has memories of this, since she was at least 4 or 5 years older than her brother. It was then that my grandfather Longo allowed my Aunt Marge and his 2 grandchildren to live upstairs in the house on Hudson Street. That is where my 2 cousins grew up, and that was where I remember spending many visits. My Aunt Marge's siblings, her 3 brothers, were very keen to help their sister and her children. As I mentioned, they positively adored Angela, and when John Jr. was born, maybe 6 or 7, my Uncle Joe Longo, who had enlisted in the army and was stationed in West Germany, bought a high-quality, full-sized accordion for him, which he learned to play well. In fact, my Aunt Marge had an upright piano on Hudson Street. Recall, our grandfather Longo played that strange double-fretted guitar He also played a mandolin, because I remember Papa Longo playing a mandolin on Hudson Street. So there was definitely a music gene in the family. The eldest of my Uncle Sal had just one child, a boy named Robert. Odd, I thought. No one among the forebears had that name. Perhaps it was because his mother, my Aunt Sophie, was, imagine this, not only not Sicilian, but not even Italian. She was Polish. I can't imagine my grandfather happy with that. However, she was very Catholic, as the Poles in Buffalo were, so I guess he tolerated her. Plus, she eventually had a nephew who became a priest, and what Catholic family doesn't want one of those in their family? It was John Sidaro Sr., an uncle I never got to know, who got my Uncle Sal a job at the Curtiss-Wright aircraft plant in Buffalo. But when the company decided to close that and move to New Jersey, my Uncle Sal took Aunt Sophie and little cousin Robert all the way to Clifton, where they lived for the rest of their lives. I'm pretty sure that at least my grandmother Longo was sad about that, as were Sal's siblings. My father, Frank Alfred Longo Jr., met Josephine Angelo, later Angelo, when in high school, where he graduated in 1946, right after the war. My dad was a drummer. He'd been since a kid, emulating the great Gene Krupa. I can only assume that he'd started playing locally after high school, but in 1950 he got drafted and sent to Korea. He was naturally a bit apprehensive, since this was actually a war, even though Congress never declared it as such. In the 2 years of that war, over 38,000 American men were killed. My dad was on the front line at first. He witnessed the carnage, but luckily was able to get into his division's band as a drummer, which got him transferred to behind the lines. During a surprise North Korean offensive that overran his division's perimeter, my dad supervised the retreat by slowing down advancing enemy troops with hand grenades from the back of a truck that was hurriedly loading men and equipment. For this, he was promoted to corporal and then later technical sergeant and received a Bronze Star. When his tour was over, he was more than glad to get home, where not long after, he finally married my mom in 1952. I was born 3 years later, the fourth eldest of my parents' children after Angela, Robert, and John Sidaro Jr. As mentioned, my dad was a drummer all his life and got to sit in with big bands like Artie Shaw's, Stan Kenton's, and Harry James. He also played in a local band in Western New York part-time for over 20 years. After starting out as a blue-collar worker, he became a successful insurance salesman with John Hancock and then Prudential, and then later sold mailing machines for Pitney Bowes and then real estate with Century 21. However, in order to get a decent pension, he took up the offer of working for the Buffalo Sewer Authority from his younger brother Joe, who had been working there for most of his adult life. My dad was then able to retire with a good pension. The youngest of my Longo grandparents' children was Joseph P. Longo. He enlisted so as to avoid his brother's fate of being drafted and shipped out to a war zone. As mentioned, he was stationed in West Germany. Before deployment, he accidentally ran into his older brother before he shipped out for Korea. My Uncle Joe was the sports nut of the family. I always remember him with a baseball mitt and bat or football, talking or watching sports. And it was he who introduced me to being a spectator of professional football when he brought me and his eldest son, Michael, to a Buffalo Bills game in their old rock-pile War Memorial Stadium back when the team was in its infancy, like 1964 or 1965. My Uncle Joe worked his way up from laborer to foreman at the Buffalo Sewer Authority, which he retired from. He also worked part-time at a camera store for many years, and because of that, he was the one in the family who took most of the family's motion pictures and photographs, often hosting viewings on a big screen at his house. On my mother's side, she was the eldest of 4 daughters born to Joe and Frances Angelo, who all grew up in that little house on Lakeview, the one with only 2.5 bedrooms and that narrow strip of a bathroom. The girls were close, but as you can imagine, bickered constantly. All of my parents' generation attended the same schools, Public School Number 3 and Grover Cleveland High School, both on the west side of Buffalo. Presumably, those schools' student bodies were comprised mainly of second-generation Sicilians. I wonder what their administrators and teachers thought. My mother and sisters were not especially academic, though my grandpa Angelo was insistent that they all get an education and finish high school. That was a big thing for my grandparents, having their kids do that. I remember the youngest of my mother's siblings, Patricia, after she met Joe Ferrudo, whom she would subsequently marry, not wanting to finish because he, her beau, dropped out a year early. My grandfather would have none of it and told her she couldn't marry him until she finished high school. My mother did, however, study stenography and typing in high school, and she was quite good at both. But in the 1950s and 60s, it was still possible to raise a family with just one breadwinner, the father. So mothers were only able to list housewife as their experience when things changed and everyone in middle class means needed 2 paychecks later instead of 1. My uncles on my mother's side were, from eldest to youngest, Carl Sacconi, Vincent Carboni, and as mentioned, Joseph Farauto, who married Caroline, Dolores, and Patricia. My Uncle Carl and Aunt Caroline were my godparents, but I barely ever got to know them. That was because not long after they were married and had their first 2 children, Carl and Suzanne, my uncle uprooted them all and moved 1,000 miles south to North Carolina, where they have lived ever since. Not only that, he changed their name from Saccone to Sacon, and also changed their religion to Judaism, though his wife and kids resisted. This drastic rejection of his ethnic and religious roots shocked and stupefied the family. But he was, and always has remained, someone with a tyrant's demeanor and what seemed like a self-loathing cloaked in an arrogantly excessive and exaggerated egotism, embracing an extreme display of Protestant work ethic mythology. So much so that he had an intense hatred of anyone who needed financial assistance for whatever reason, to the point that he subjected his children to this bootstrap deprivation philosophy. But all of this was not only ironic, but an egregious hypocrisy. His self-made success as a builder of his own home, which he then sold, and of a restaurant, was enabled by the large windfall death benefit he received when his sister died shortly after he got married to my aunt. Without that substantial head start, he wouldn't have been able to embark on his self-made success. To illustrate his haughtiness and arrogance, there was an incident early on when my grandfather, Joe Angelo, needed help to pave part of his backyard with concrete. At the time, Carl was still living in Western New York, and he and the other 3 brothers-in-law agreed to help. On the day of the project, my dad and Uncles Vin and Joe Ferrudo were there helping with the cement work. But where was Uncle Carl? He was late. So late that when he arrived, most of the heavy work had been done. And my Aunt Dee, Vin's wife, who was there along with the other sisters, said to him, "So, where have you been? I thought you were going to help." His response was, "Well, I don't work with my hands, I work with my head." My Aunt Dee said she almost belted him, and my uncles and father had to hold back as well. Well, my uncles Vinny and Joe were blue-collar workers most of their lives, but they earned a decent living doing it. Vin worked for a long time at Western Electric, and Joe worked for most of his adult life for the New York State Thruway Authority. When hard times hit the factories in western New York and Western Electric closed their plant and moved south, my Uncle Vin, who was so thoroughly a Sicilian-American from the west side of Buffalo, decided he didn't want to leave. He managed to stay there through periods of unemployment when his wife, my Aunt Dee, worked locally at a cleaner's and at a delicatessen until he finally was able to get a job at Moog, from which he retired with a good pension. My Uncle Joe Ferrudo also retired with a good pension from the Thruway. Not bad for someone who dropped out of high school. Of course, my Uncle Joe Ferrudo had a little help from some friends. Some of his closest buddies, going way back, had ties to local mafia. Though Uncle Joe never joined them, he kept himself in such good standing with those guys, who remained friends with him, that, shall we say, much of the remodeling and new appliances that my Aunt Pat wanted for her house was acquired with very little expenditure. I was only about 7 or 8 when I was in his and my Aunt Pat's wedding party. And I remember all those guys who livened up our subsequent Christmas parties dressing up as Santa Claus. I should add, however, that the last time I saw one of them was about 1980 or so, when I was standing outside the downtown Buffalo courthouse, and he was wearing an orange jumpsuit and had hand and ankle cuffs on. Alas, they are all gone. All my great-grandparents, grandparents, both my parents, and my aunts and uncles, except 3, who are piteous vestiges, little more than shadows of the extended family of the Sicilians who emigrated to Buffalo a century ago. 2 of them are beyond redemption. The eldest is the one most reviled and despised, even by his own children, my Uncle Carl, who in his 90s lives with some woman who, I have been told, is trying to ensure that none of his children inherit a penny from his assets. A wretched misanthrope, as he's always been, he is an outcast of the family. I do not now, nor have I ever considered him even a part of La Famiglia, and I am sure he's always wanted it that way. The youngest, my Aunt Pat, is in a nursing home, where she's been since my Uncle Joe died. The trauma of his passing from lung cancer sent her into an early onset of dementia. She is little more than a child, drifting further and further away. And the third is my Aunt Agnes, wife of my Uncle Joe Longo, who passed last year from COVID at age 90. I have tried to reach out to her to reconnect when I was planning on visiting and stoke some interest in my being the only one of us to return to Sicily, and in writing my memoirs. But she seems far too wrapped up in grief and sorrow over the loss of Uncle Joe that she just wants to dwell in that. Sad, depressing, and such a loss. I alone seem the only one who has taken concrete steps to discover and recover our roots, our ancestry, and to preserve as much of it as possible. But all is not totally lost, for I have received immense gratitude, applause, and interest from at least 2 cousins, John Sodaro Jr. and Cindy Manino, who was the daughter of my Aunt Dee and Uncle Vin, as well as from my sisters Linda and Lorianne, and from my niece Emily, Linda's daughter, for all of my efforts, as well as from my ex-wife Laura, the mother of my only child, my son Stephen. It is indeed a shame that more among my extended family can't feel the same.